In September 2011, autumn mist blanketed the old outbuilding on the outskirts of Columbia, South Carolina, where a covert surveillance team had been watching for weeks. Infrared lights from the surveillance unit swept across the rotting wooden walls, picking up an unusual heat signature, something no one expected but no one could ignore. Command Center, we have movement inside. Request immediate deployment of the response team. Agent Langford's voice cut through the comms channel, mixing with the wind slicing through the pitch-black trees. What began as a random DNA hit from a single burglary case had exploded into something entirely different, dragging up a missing person file that had gathered dust for more than 2 decades. Behind a false wall in the empty back room, the SWAT team discovered precise cuts and a hidden metal door, proof this was no ordinary storage shed. In the Georgia cold case files, the name Ava Wilson, age 14, had been pushed aside with 2 words, runaway. Now it returned like a ghost that refused to stay buried. For 21 years, Ava's disappearance had been a wound the Augusta community learned to live with. A girl who left school and never came home. A white van that was overlooked. A DNA clue that was entered under the wrong code and lost in the system. When the 1990 search went cold, the case was closed with a single chilling note, victim's location undetermined. Edward Hale kept living quietly across multiple states. No one asked the right questions, no one charged him, and no one knew what lay behind those sealed doors. But 2 decades later, a faint fingerprint on a backpack zipper, evidence once dismissed as meaningless, changed everything. As the DNA was reanalyzed and the truth began to surface, layer by layer, every old assumption collapsed. The discovery in the Columbia outbuilding wasn't just a breakthrough in one case, it was the first domino that toppled 21 years of mistakes, silence, and misjudgments. The truth about a victim's isolation, the system's failures, and the cost of ignoring even the smallest red flag. Because the final suspect wasn't some nameless stranger, he had appeared on the 1990 list, then been removed because of a single mistyped character. The Ava Wilson case is not just a mystery solved. It is proof of persistence, of the power of modern forensics, and evidence that justice, even delayed by 21 years, never truly disappeared. Tonight we'll go back to the afternoon of September 14, 1990, follow Georgia's most haunting missing person case, and watch the truth finally find its way back into the light. Before we dive deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. In 1990, Augusta, a southern city along Georgia's Savannah River, still moved at the slow, steady pace of late 20th century America. Quiet neighborhoods with 2-story wooden houses, public schools ringing their dismissal bells every afternoon, and church-centered community life created a sense of safety most local families trusted, without question. The Wilson family lived inside that familiar rhythm. Linda Wilson worked night shifts as a nurse, Mark Wilson at the paper mill by the river, and their 2 kids, Michael and Ava, attended Lakeside Middle School just a short walk from home. 14-year-old Ava Wilson was quiet, studious, and introspective. She preferred reading or drawing in the evenings, while her 16-year-old brother, Michael, was more outgoing and always looked out for his little sister in their daily routine. The siblings naturally stuck together. They walked to school together, walked home together, and usually cut across the basketball court before turning onto the side street that led to their neighborhood, a habit repeated for years. On the afternoon of September 14, 1990, Lakeside Middle School let out at 3 o'clock. The schoolyard buzzed with students pouring out of classrooms, and Ava and Michael headed toward the gate as usual. While crossing the basketball court, Michael noticed a white van parked crookedly right up against the fence, a van he had never seen in the area before. It didn't look like any parent's car he recognized, and the man standing beside it wasn't a familiar face from the neighborhood. Still in the chaos of dismissal, Michael only glanced over without suspicion. Right then, a teammate called him over for a quick word, turning his attention away for a few seconds. When he looked back, Ava was closer to the van and the stranger was approaching her. The flood of students kept blocking his view, and when Michael tried to push closer, everything happened too fast. The van door slammed shut, the vehicle pulled away, and it was gone from the school ground. From a distance, Michael couldn't be sure whether Ava had gotten inside or had simply been standing nearby when the van left. He hesitated for a few seconds, then kept walking home out of habit, figuring Ava might have run into someone she knew, or taken a different route. But when he got home and Ava still wasn't there, initial confusion quickly turned to real worry. Linda started calling other parents to ask if Ava had gone home with anyone, then phoned neighbors in case she had stopped at a friend's house. No one had seen Ava after dismissal. Michael recounted what he had seen: the white van, the strange man, and how Ava disappeared from his sight for a few minutes. Mark immediately jumped in the car and drove around the school area, side streets, the grassy lot behind the basketball court, the convenience store nearby, places Ava sometimes stopped. Some neighbors joined the search, walking along the fence line in the empty lots near campus. A few witnesses thought they had seen Ava standing near a man, while others vaguely recalled a white vehicle leaving faster than normal, but no one could offer anything concrete or useful. The scattered, imprecise details only made the family more frantic. As darkness fell, Michael and Mark still hadn't found any sign of her, and Linda grew increasingly distraught as the minutes ticked by with no clear leads. The family and neighbors' impromptu search lasted over an hour, but turned up nothing. By just after 6 p.m., Linda realized this was no longer a case of Ava getting lost or staying late at school. She picked up the phone and called 911 to report that her 14-year-old daughter was missing. When Linda's call reached the 911 dispatcher and was routed to the Richmond County Sheriff's Office, the report of a female teenager missing after school was logged, but it did not trigger the same urgency as cases with obvious signs of violence. The nearest patrol unit was dispatched to Lakeside Middle School for an initial check and to follow up with the Wilson family for basic facts. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived at the school gate, where only a handful of afternoon duty teachers and late-arriving parents remained. Michael was asked to recount everything in chronological order: dismissal time, the route he and Ava took, the moment he saw the white van, the stranger, and the vehicle leaving the area. He tried to recall every detail as accurately as possible, but because his view had been blocked by the crowd of students and the suddenness of the situation, Michael could not clearly describe the man's face or anything specific about the van beyond its white color and older style. Meanwhile, Linda and Mark explained to the officers their own initial search efforts around the school and the side streets Ava might have taken. However, since there were no clear signs of violence, no torn belongings, no cries for help, no signs of a struggle, the officer handling the initial scene leaned toward the possibility that this was a teenager who had left the area voluntarily without telling anyone, a common runaway scenario in missing teen reports of that era. Linda strongly objected, insisting Ava had no reason or history of running away, but the patrol unit's preliminary assessment still relied on common statistics. Most teens reported missing after school were simply with friends or away from home for a few hours. The low-priority classification meant follow-up procedures were not fully escalated. Police only conducted a quick sweep of the school grounds, the grass along the fence, the basketball court area, and the first stretch of road toward the neighborhood. They shone flashlights into a few overgrown spots and noted the location of the white van Michael described, but found no obvious evidence on site. Because nearly 3 hours had passed since dismissal, the scene had been heavily trafficked by hundreds of students, parents, and vehicles, meaning any potential traces had likely been disturbed or destroyed. More critically, police did not cordon off the area or establish a preserved crime scene because they did not yet classify this as an abduction. That decision meant footprints, tire tracks, or small dropped items were never collected, leaving the initial evidence pool thin and difficult to cross-reference. Inside the school, on-duty officers spoke with the remaining teachers and a few late parents, gathering scattered statements. Some said they had seen students near the basketball court, but no one confirmed seeing Ava with a man. Others vaguely recalled a white van leaving the area but couldn't pin down the exact time. The initial witness statements were mostly uncertain, vague, and hard to use for preliminary analysis. Police recorded everything in the first report but could not yet assess the value of each piece of information. After completing the quick check around campus, patrol expanded the radius to nearby streets. The narrow path connecting the court to side roads, the area behind the nearby convenience store, and the vacant lot where kids sometimes hung out. They found none of Ava's belongings, no drag marks, no unusual disturbances on the ground, and no significant new witnesses. From the Wilson family's side, they continued providing police with every detail about Ava's habits: close friends, usual routes, places she sometimes stopped after school, and repeated assurances that Ava showed no psychological signs or personal issues that would make her leave voluntarily. Yet without concrete proof she had been forced or was in danger, the file remained in the regular missing person category, delaying any escalation of manpower. By late that evening, patrol wrapped up the initial information roundup. Michael's brief statement, the vague description of a white van, family notes, and a handful of scattered witness accounts. No preserved scene, no physical evidence, no reliable description to issue a wider alert. All of those early facts, while properly documented under minimum procedure, lacked the depth needed for a serious juvenile missing person case and became the severely limited starting point for the entire investigation that followed. Reconstructing the timeline from scattered witness statements failed to pinpoint a clear location for Ava's disappearance, forcing investigators to expand the search beyond the school grounds, starting with the residential neighborhoods surrounding Lakeside Middle School, the area Ava and Michael passed through every day. Neighbors quickly received word from the Wilson family and joined in, forming a spontaneous search group before police could deploy full resources. Residents near the school began checking backyards, abandoned houses, rarely used garages, and the narrow alleys connecting rows of homes. Police divided the area into small search grids to avoid missing anything, using flashlights to probe bushes and narrow paths where kids sometimes gathered after school. However, the heavy foot traffic at dismissal time had already disturbed the environment. Any potential evidence risked being obscured or contaminated, especially footprints in soft soil. A second search prong was directed along the side streets connecting the school complex to Washington Road, an area busy with afternoon traffic. A patrol team swept those routes, checking roadside ditches, the parking lots of nearby convenience stores, and the row of warehouses behind the small commercial strip. At these locations, officers questioned lingering groups of students, but none provided useful information. Meanwhile, Mark Wilson and several neighbors pushed eastward toward quieter roads, leading to vacant land. They called Ava's name repeatedly, checking small slopes and gentle inclines down to tree lines, but found no clear sign. As dusk fell, the search extended to the Savannah River bank, where the ground was rocky and thick with brush along the embankment. Police sent teams in both directions along the river, probing clusters of trees and rock crevices. Rescue personnel walked the road paralleling the water, examining every spot where small items could be hidden. Under flashlight beams, they scanned soft earth, but found no evidence linked to Ava. Some residents reported having seen groups of teenagers in the area earlier that week, making it hard to distinguish old traces from new. The riverbank search continued until natural light was no longer sufficient, forcing teams to stand down and regroup. During this time, several tips came in from the public. Someone thought they saw a girl running through a small wooded area near Sumter National Forest. Another claimed to have heard a strange sound like a scream, but couldn't pinpoint the exact time. Such reports were deemed low reliability, more a product of community panic than solid information. Still, to cover all possibilities, patrols extended to the edge of Sumter National Forest, a large wooded area with many trails leading deep inside. Searchers followed main paths, checking dense vegetation and clearings where vehicles might stop. They examined a dirt lot beside an old road sometimes used by overnight truckers, but found no tire tracks matching the white van described in statement. Barking dogs from homes along the forest edge made it hard to isolate environmental sounds, and no noise could be tied to Ava. As night fell, flashlights and headlamps were used heavily, but darkness in the woods severely limited visibility. Teams broke the area into concentric search circles starting from the perimeter inward to prevent spreading too thin. Despite the effort, they found no torn clothing, personal items or movement signs directly connected to Ava. Reports only noted unrelated debris, plastic pieces, old cardboard, and footprints likely from hikers days earlier. Back in the neighborhood, another false lead surfaced when a resident reported seeing a figure resembling Ava running along a southern stretch of road, but when police checked, they only found a group of kids playing in a yard. Repeated false sightings forced searchers to constantly reprioritize, focusing more on areas where Ava might have wandered off or been taken through. Yet with no direct physical evidence or clear indicators, every search direction remained guesswork. Even as volunteer numbers grew with each news update, actual effectiveness stayed low due to the lack of solid starting information. The wide area search lasted many hours, covering most of the vicinity around the school and surrounding roads large and small, but ultimately police had to conclude that no specific physical evidence directly related to Ava had been collected during this entire initial phase. The whole early effort produced only a map marked with dozens of checked locations, none showing clear signs of Ava's presence after she left the school gate. The exhaustive search, yielding no direct physical evidence or credible leads, forced investigators to reassess all initial data. In the first internal briefing, a veteran detective argued that Ava's case fit the runaway profile far better than an organized abduction. The argument relied on contemporary statistics, showing most reported missing teenagers had either left home voluntarily or gone to a friend's house without telling anyone, especially when there were no signs of a struggle or evidence of force. This conclusion immediately affected how Ava's file was prioritized, shifting it from urgent response to open monitoring status, which meant reduced manpower and an end to large-scale searches. Some units were pulled back to handle other pending cases, leaving a small team to follow up on scattered tips. Inside the investigation team, the assessment wasn't universally accepted, but was applied anyway due to lack of strong counter-evidence. For the Wilson family, learning that the case had been deprioritized sparked outrage. Linda vehemently objected, stressing that Ava had shown no psychological instability or personal conflicts before disappearing. The school confirmed Ava was a diligent, well-behaved student, with no history of truancy or issues she needed to escape. Michael repeatedly described the white van and strange man, but his statement was considered unreliable because no one else provided a matching description. Tensions rose between the family and investigators when Linda argued that over-relying on runaway statistics caused police to overlook key signs that Ava may have been approached by a stranger in the crowded dismissal chaos. Family frustration spread to the community, where some neighbors believed Ava's unusual disappearance warranted emergency status from the start. Meanwhile, local media began covering the story as rumors of a missing 14-year-old girl spread. Early articles were mostly factual updates, but commentary soon followed about delays in the initial official response. Some reporters questioned whether failing to lock down the scene or fully consider abduction from the outset had squandered the critical golden hours for search and rescue. Short local TV segments reflected divided opinions. Some experts said runaway remained the rational default without evidence, while others argued the white van and unknown man were reason enough to treat it as possible abduction. Though media pressure was not yet intense, the multi-sided analysis put the case under public debate, eroding consistency and investigative direction. In that atmosphere, lines of inquiry drifted away from abduction because investigators couldn't establish Ava's last known location with collected data. Efforts shifted toward the possibility she left school voluntarily with someone she knew or on a teenage impulse. Police even reviewed her class friend list to check whether she might have gone to someone's house unannounced. This led to questions about Ava's private life, but no conflicts or secrets surfaced. In the following days, field search activity was sharply curtailed, replaced by reviews of school records, daily routines, and Ava's pre-disappearance activities. This produced no breakthroughs. Ava had a stable routine and limited social circle, yielding little actionable data. Each passing day without new signs further entrenched the runaway theory for some detectives, even as the Wilsons insisted Ava did not fit the profile of kids who leave home on their own. This early misdirection significantly reduced follow-up on the suspect vehicle and unknown man, and initial white van data was not pursued aggressively. Within the investigation team, disagreement over approach became evident. Some wanted to keep abduction on the table, while others saw continued focus on the van as a waste of resources, without supporting evidence. By the end of this phase, the Ava Wilson case sat in limbo. Too little evidence to confirm abduction, too many inconsistencies to prove runaway, and lowered priority left the entire investigation stalled. The investigation's heavy tilt toward the runaway theory left the Wilson family with almost no official support for continued searching, as allocated personnel had dropped sharply. In that vacuum, neighbors and community members kept small volunteer groups active, checking less obvious areas around the school and neighborhood. One volunteer team decided to extend their sweep along a stretch of dense brush to the east, an area rarely visited but accessible via several side paths near the sports fields. While pushing through thick grass, a volunteer spotted a soft-cover book caked with dirt beneath dry leaves, faint handwritten marks inside matched the symbols Ava habitually used in her textbooks. Such an item was not something Ava would casually drop, and it clashed with the idea she left willingly. Ava was known for taking meticulous care of her books. The find was reported to Linda, then quickly passed to investigators. Detectives arrived, marked the exact spot on maps, and widened the search radius around it. While combing the edge of a clearing a few dozen paces from the book, another team member found a broken backpack zipper pull under a thin layer of soil. The style matched the description of the backpack Ava carried on the day she vanished. Though small, its location was well off the route she walked with Michael and far from normal after-school hangout. The placement of both items suggested Ava had been taken through an area no ordinary student would choose. Investigators re-examined all prior statements, especially dismissal routes, last sightings of Ava, and the final point Michael clearly saw her. Nothing supported the idea she voluntarily headed toward where the items were found. The path led neither home nor anywhere familiar. The brush-choked area was outside regular foot traffic, and rugged, not a place a teenager would walk alone unless forced off her normal route. The two items being close together indicated Ava may have been dragged or pushed in that direction, or struggled and dropped things while being moved. The investigation began discarding the runaway theory. No remaining argument could sustain the claim she left on her own. The nature and location of the evidence pointed unambiguously external interference in Ava's movements. A soft-cover book shoved under leaves, and a torn zipper pull mixed in brush did not suggest voluntary abandonment, but rather a chaotic situation. Mapping the finds against the broader area, detectives determined the discovery site lay along a possible line of movement connecting to where multiple witnesses had reported seeing the white van. This data swung the investigation back toward the abduction scenario the Wilsons had insisted on all along. Internal reports were rewritten to reclassify risk based on the new evidence. Instead of treating the case as a voluntary teen departure, the file was shifted to stranger intervention danger. Analytical models changed too. Evidence drop points were now used to plot whether Ava was pulled along a dirt path or forced into a vehicle nearby. The distance from the school gate to the finds also made voluntary travel impossible in the short window without being seen, especially amid dismissal crowds. Every factor pointed to the same conclusion. Ava did not leave willingly. The Wilsons were notified and immediately demanded the case priority be restored. Linda stressed that the items proved Ava had encountered danger right after leaving school grounds. The appearance of her book and zipper pull galvanized community support again. These were the first concrete signs since her disappearance. Small search groups resumed sweeping nearby areas with renewed determination, while investigators restarted scrutiny of all white van data. From this moment, the understanding of the incident was corrected. Rather than viewing Ava as a teen who vanished under a typical runaway pattern, analysis shifted to her being approached against her will and removed from the school area along a route that did not match her daily walk home. The case entered a phase where every deduction had to rest on the premise that Ava lost agency the instant she stepped out the school gate. Abandoning the runaway theory and shifting focus to the possibility that Ava had been approached against her will, forced the investigation team to comb through the entire list of potential persons of interest in the area, around the school, and where her belongings were found, starting with individuals who had prior records or documented behavior. The first person added to the list was a man who lived not far from the school and had a previous conviction for disorderly conduct and attempting to approach minors in public places a few years earlier. Many parents in the neighborhood were wary of him because he often showed up near the sports fields at odd hours. Investigators went to his home, checked his schedule, and cross-verified it with security footage from the store where he worked. The footage showed he was at work from before school let out until well after Ava disappeared. Multiple employees confirmed he never left the premises during that window, and he was clear. The second suspect was a physical education teacher who years earlier had been accused by parents of inappropriate behavior toward female students during practice sessions. The matter had not led to criminal charges at the time, only an internal reprimand. Since Ava regularly walked past the sports area, the team considered whether this teacher might have been nearby when she vanished. His teaching schedule showed he had a class that afternoon at an elementary school about a mile from Lakeside Middle School. Attendance records from that school and statements from colleagues confirmed he was there and never came to the Lakeside campus that day. Several elementary students recalled seeing him right before dismissal time at Lakeside, further solidifying his alibi. Despite his controversial past prompting closer scrutiny, no evidence placed him in the area where Ava was approached. The third suspect was a local delivery truck driver who had parked an older white van near the school on several afternoons prior to the disappearance to make deliveries to a nearby sports equipment repair shop. Some witnesses thought the van they saw the day Ava disappeared was similar in size to his, so he was brought in for questioning. Delivery records and the receiving store's staff confirmed he had left the area well before school let out and arrived at his next stop more than 5 miles away. Security camera footage from the second store showed him at the counter at the exact time Ava was leaving school, making direct involvement impossible. His vehicle was inspected, the license plate did not match the vague witness descriptions, and exterior details were markedly different from what had been reported. After clearing these 3 initial suspects, investigators returned to the broader open list of individuals seen near the school in the preceding weeks. Among them was Edward Hale, a man who had been noted hanging around Lakeside Middle School on several late afternoons. Local police knew Hale mainly for minor parking violations and one noise complaint at a low-budget motel. His record contained no serious crimes or threats toward minors, so he was placed only in the search-and-rescue pool of persons of interest, not the primary suspect group. When detectives called the contact address on file, the motel manager said Hale had moved out several weeks before Ava's disappearance and relocated elsewhere, though he could not confirm the exact location. The information was noted but not prioritized, as nothing placed Hale at the school on the day in question. A few witnesses vaguely recalled seeing a man of similar build in the area, but no one was certain it was Hale, and descriptions of his vehicle did not fully match the suspected white van. Due to the lack of concrete data, Hale's name remained on the open list but was not actively pursued. Internally, clearing the first 3 suspects exposed a core problem. The pool of potential suspects was vast, yet the accuracy of witness statements was low, causing every lead to quickly hit a dead end. All physical evidence recovered so far, the textbook and backpack zipper, only proved Ava had not left voluntarily. It did not point to any individual. There was no biological evidence, no useful camera footage, no witness who clearly saw a license plate, and no detail capable of narrowing the suspect pool. Although the 3 initial persons of interest had been eliminated, the investigation still had no intersection between physical evidence, witness statements, and people known to be in the area. Hale's name was just one of many scattered data points, not significant enough to prioritize. By the end of this phase, the team noted that ruling out the 3 suspects had only highlighted the case's gaping holes rather than providing a clearer direction, and the open list remained unchanged, with no standout entry for deeper follow-up. Clearing the first 3 suspects and failing to develop new evidence quickly pushed the investigation into stagnation, as every continued effort to gather additional physical evidence or statements yielded no concrete leads. The areas where Ava's textbook and zipper had been found were searched multiple additional times, but no further fragments or signs that could be linked to her route turned up. The ground in those locations was too easily disturbed by weather and foot traffic for the team to recover any overlooked traces. Moreover, the vast natural areas around the school and along the Savannah River contained far too many spots that could not be thoroughly checked without specific indicators. In the weeks that followed, police received a handful of new tips from the public, but nearly all proved worthless. Many people only vaguely recalled seeing a girl who somewhat resembled Ava in various parts of town. When checked, those sightings were always other local students. Some reported hearing noises at night near vacant lots, but follow-ups found only animal tracks or ordinary resident activity. Not a single tip provided specific information about the white van or a strange man connected to the exact time Ava disappeared. Each new report was logged, but all were soon crossed off as inconsistent with the initial timeline or unverifiable. The sheer volume of these false leads made it increasingly difficult for the team to maintain focus. With no visible progress, the department began scaling back case review meetings and reassigning personnel to other pending matters, shifting resources away from Ava's case. Patrol units originally dedicated to the search returned to regular duties, leaving only a small core group to update files as needed. Internal reports increasingly described the case as no basis for expansion, and its priorities steadily dropped. This reduction in manpower significantly hampered the ability to keep canvassing large areas or digging deeper into the remaining persons of interest list. Meanwhile, the Wilson family, initially working closely with investigators, shifted to independent search efforts, unwilling to accept the slowing official pace. Linda and Mark organized neighborhood walkthroughs with neighbors, went door to door, posted fresh flyers around the school and along Washington Road stores. Michael kept returning to the school to ask former classmates if anything new had come to mind about that afternoon, but the repetitive answers only deepened his helplessness. The family attended every community meeting, pleading with residents not to forget, yet public interest gradually faded without new developments to sustain it. Some residents began believing Ava had left the area very early on, making local searching pointless. Others reverted to the runaway theory despite the family's firm objection. In police files, the Ava Wilson case slowly moved into the no progress category, reviewed only if a major break or report from another jurisdiction surfaced. This was evident in the discontinuation of regular case-specific meetings and in supplemental notes that became purely administrative rather than analytical. Though never officially closed, the investigation was effectively sidelined due to lack of useful information and evidence, leaving the family in limbo and the team responsible only for reacting to any sudden tips. Years of stagnation pushed the Ava Wilson file to the bottom of the local caseload, and in 1995, following standard procedure for long-dormant missing person cases, the Richmond County Sheriff's Office transferred the entire file to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for inclusion in the state-level cold case unit and fresh review. At GBI, investigator Sarah Langford was assigned the hundreds of pages initial reports, search logs, witness statements, photos of the school grounds, and the list of suspects vetted in the early stages. Langford began by reorganizing all preserved physical evidence and reviewing the chain of custody logs to determine whether items collected in 1990 had been lost or improperly handled. Serious deficiencies quickly emerged. Items like the textbook and zipper pull had not been sealed to modern standards, rendering them too contaminated for meaningful analysis. Many early samples were essentially worthless due to lax storage practices at the time. She also re-examined witness statements from students and teachers, finding most had been taken amid chaos, were fragmented, and contained numerous inconsistencies that made detailed reconstruction difficult. Some statements had incorrect dates copied over, and descriptions of the white van or strange man were overly brief and lacked specific identifying details. The failure to secure the scene at the school gate and lock down the area immediately meant countless potential traces were never collected, creating irrecoverable gaps. After working through every item, Langford turned to the suspect list. The original 3 remained solidly alibied and were not reopened. The broader open list of individuals seen near the school beforehand also yielded nothing substantial. Several had moved, some were no longer in Georgia, and the original vague descriptions could not be tied to any surviving evidence. Reviewing maps in all prior search locations, Langford noted that initial searches had covered a wide area but lacked depth, while key spots like where Ava's belongings were recovered had never received the thorough standardized surveys required by state protocol. GBI located no new physical evidence in storage and found no basis for a large-scale reopening. Existing data was simply too sparse to generate a viable new investigative direction, and most evidence had been compromised by outdated collection and preservation methods. Though Langford documented every shortfall from file organization to evidence integrity, the findings were insufficient to revive a case dormant for 5 years. Upon completion, she concluded that while the Ava Wilson file deserved to remain active in the cold case system for future tips or breakthroughs, the current information did not meet the threshold for reopening at the state level. The case was archived as insufficient data to expand, marking yet another prolonged phase of deadlock and leaving an unfillable void in the investigative record for the entire first half-decade since Ava vanished. The moment the case was transferred to the GBI and fell into a deadlock was also when everything that happened to Ava in the first days after her disappearance became something only she would ever truly know. From the victim's viewpoint, the initial phase of captivity took place in a small rundown house on the outskirts of Evans. Not too far from Ava's school, but isolated enough to draw no attention. The house sat far back behind a row of trees, its windows completely boarded up with old plywood. The room where Ava was locked was barely large enough for a thin mattress thrown on the floor and a broken chair leaning against the wall. No natural light entered except through a tiny gap between the boards, keeping the room in perpetual half-darkness no matter the time of day. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of rotting wood, mixed with sounds from downstairs whose source Ava never saw. Survival conditions were kept to the absolute minimum. Food was brought in at irregular intervals, mostly canned goods or leftovers shoved hastily onto the floor, and water was poured into an old plastic bottle. Access to even these basic needs depended entirely on her captor. With no clock or calendar in the room, Ava quickly lost all sense of day and night. The perpetrator's control showed in every detail. The door was always secured from the outside with 2 deadbolts. The only movement Ava was allowed was a few steps around the cramped space. Any attempt to memorize hallways or the rest of the house was made impossible, because she was never permitted to see anything beyond this single room. Whenever the door opened, the man's silhouette completely blocked the view, preventing Ava from orienting herself in the space. The man maintained near total silence, never answering her questions and never giving her any information about location, time, or what was happening outside. This control not only stopped her from learning about her surroundings, but also made his behavior unpredictable, turning any thought of resistance into something dangerous. In the first hours of captivity, Ava tried to find any weakness in the room. She tested the doorframe, tapped lightly on walls looking for rotted wood, pushed hard on the lower bolt when she heard footsteps walking away. But the slightest noise brought the man instantly back, teaching her that every escape attempt was tightly monitored. There were no windows to crawl through, no secondary exits, no objects in the room that could give her an advantage. Ava had to accept that this initial phase of confinement offered virtually no chance of escape. Total isolation from the outside world made time inside the room blur. The only sounds she ever heard were occasional footsteps on the wooden floor, the metallic scrape of the locks, and very distant traffic muffled through thick walls. There were no other voices, no sign anyone else lived in the house besides the captor, no sound that suggested a chance to cry for help. In that isolation, Ava began to realize that any signal from the outside, even the faintest sound, could become the only source of information to keep her grounded. She listened to far-off cars to guess whether the house was near a main road, tried to track the intensity of light through the wood gap to estimate the time of day, and paid attention to the intermittent sounds the man made moving around the house to map his routine. Though these fragments weren't enough to pinpoint where she was, they were the only way she had to stay mentally alert. At this stage, Ava could not know where her prison was located or predict what would happen next. What was clearest was that she was completely cut off from the outside world, in a cramped, totally controlled space with no conditions or opportunities to escape her first place of captivity. The time spent locked in the Evans room stretched on until Ava could no longer tell day from night, but that phase ended abruptly when the man forced her to leave the room without any warning. Her head was covered with a thick cloth, her hands loosely tied in front with soft cord, enough to control her but not injure, and she was pushed into the back seat of an old car that reeked of gasoline and worn leather. The first drive was bumpy, the road surface constantly shifting from concrete to gravel, indicating they were heading into a more rural area. When the car stopped, Ava was led across soft ground through several sharp turns. The heavy smell of damp vegetation told her the new location was deep in dense forest. Later she would learn it was the edge of Sumter National Forest. The second holding site was a makeshift old cabin, smaller than the Evans house but far more secluded, with almost no sound penetrating except wind moving through the treetops. The room inside the cabin had only a thin mattress directly on the rotted wooden floor, a bucket of water for basic use, and an old blanket that still smelled of mildew. The main door was secured with a heavy metal bar, and the single window was covered by thick planking with no gaps for light to determine time. Food continued to arrive at irregular intervals, sometimes only once a day, forcing Ava to ration herself to the bare minimum. To keep from losing track of time completely, Ava began noting tiny cues most people would ignore. Slight temperature changes in the room, wind picking up at night, the volume of insect sounds rising or falling in cycles. These helped her roughly mark the passing of time, even if imprecise. She counted food deliveries to estimate days. Despite the irregular pattern, it was still useful for staying aware. In the cabin there was almost no trace of the outside world. No voices, no traffic, no sign of anyone besides the captor. The isolation here was far deeper than the first house, forcing Ava to rely entirely on hearing and touch to understand her surroundings. With no windows or light gaps, she could only orient herself by the smell of damp wood, moss and earth that seeped in whenever the captor opened the door. This forest phase lasted an unknown length of time, but Ava became so familiar with the captor's movements that she could tell when he was approaching the cabin by the weight of his footsteps, the jangle of keys, or the scrape of metal on metal. That awareness didn't help her escape, but it was the only way she stayed alert. After a long stretch in the woods, she was once again blindfolded and moved. This drive was longer and smoother, mostly on paved roads. When she got out, there was no forest smell. Instead, the air suggested a sparsely populated residential area that wasn't completely isolated. The third location was an old warehouse in the Athens area, larger than the previous two but divided into one small interior room, just big enough for Ava to lie flat. The room was built with temporary wooden walls, the door locked from outside, and the only light a thin strip high near the ceiling through a board gap. This space was colder, poorly ventilated, but carried more distant sounds, waves of cars on a major road, machinery from nearby homes, even occasional barking dogs. These were the first hints of outside life Ava had heard in a long time, yet they led to no chance of contact. The captor kept his rule of silence, appearing only to deliver food or tidy a few items, never speaking, and never allowing Ava to move beyond a few steps. There were no reachable windows, no gaps large enough to see through, and no objects that could be used to pick the lock. Throughout every transfer, Ava never encountered anyone except the captor. No one saw her being moved. No one heard cries for help. Each holding site was chosen so contact with the outside world was virtually zero. Across these different locations, the clearest thing to Ava was that the captor controlled every aspect of her environment: location, light, sound, daily rhythm, making any thought of escape remain only imagination, never turning into real action. The extremely faint records of where Ava was taken and how she endured multiple confinement phases only highlighted the long-standing information gaps in the file. As part of routine cold case continuity efforts, GBI periodically re-examined old evidence to assess whether newer technology could recover data. While reviewing preserved samples, technicians discovered that the backpack zipper pull, previously deemed too contaminated during 1990 collection, still had areas of surface less abraded than expected. Those areas had not been properly processed initially, leading the original report to conclude no usable fingerprints. However, using improved chemical fingerprint enhancement techniques that GBI began adopting in the late 1990s, the team decided to retest in hopes of recovering anything. The result was unexpected. A faint, partial fingerprint cluster with enough characteristics for comparison emerged from the remaining metal edge. This was a foreign print, not belonging to Ava or any family member on record. The clear error was that this print cluster had never been documented in the 1990 forensic file, never compared, and never entered into the state system, even though it could have been the case's most critical piece of evidence. GBI entered the partial print into the 1997 matching system and compared it against the standardizing automated identification database. The system returned a high similarity match with an individual in old Richmond County residency records, Edward Hale, a name that had appeared on the original suspect list but was never prioritized due to minor criminal history and no direct link to the disappearance. However, when analysts pulled Hale's detailed file for manual comparison, they found a strange discrepancy. The 1990 local entry for Hale used a personal ID code that did not fully match the state system's stored code. In other words, a single character had been mistyped when local data was uploaded, meaning every comparison run from 1990 to 1995 had never hit Hale's ASL record, even though the system was capable of detecting the similarity. This error not only caused the fingerprint to be overlooked initially but also resulted in Hale being incorrectly categorized as low risk and never deeply cross-checked in any prior suspect review. Investigator Sarah Langford immediately documented the issue in an internal report, clearly stating two serious mistakes: improper evidence collection that prevented the print from being identified per protocol, and a data entry error that kept a potential suspect from ever being correctly flagged. The report also stated that had the data been handled correctly in 1990, investigators at the time could have requested direct questioning of Hale, or a thorough check of his activities and residence. Yet despite uncovering two major errors, Langford had insufficient grounds to recommend a full-scale reopening. The recovered print was only partial and faint, unusable as courtroom evidence at that point. The match showed high similarity but not absolute verification. Moreover, Hale's file contained no specific information placing him near Lakeside Middle School on the day Ava vanished. The system's fingerprint suggestion was treated only as a note to retain in the file, insufficient to change the cold case status. In closing, Langford emphasized that the Ava Wilson case continued to be crippled by early forensic errors. Errors that, even when identified, provided too little new data to generate a fresh investigative direction, leaving the case frozen in GBI's system. The discovery of forensic errors and insufficient data matching to justify reopening the investigation kept Ava's case stuck in cold case status. To maintain federal visibility, the GBI forwarded the file to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, for long-term public awareness support. NCMEC took the original 1990 photographs of Ava and began the age progression process, creating simulated images of how her face might look at different ages, based on anthropometric data, genetics, family photos, and typical adolescent to adult development pattern. Experts produced 3 progressed images, age 18, age 22 and approximately 25. Each was carefully adjusted for skin tone, bone structure and predicted changes over time using family reference material. The resulting images were realistic enough to jog public memory and rekindle attention to a case that had dragged on for years. When NCMEC released the Age Progressed series on federal platforms and distributed them to law enforcement agencies nationwide, the search was no longer confined to Georgia. The federal network pushed the images and details to thousands of police departments, community organizations, hospital shelters and youth centers, opening the possibility of identifying homeless individuals, undocumented persons, or unidentified young women who might match Ava's progressed likeness. In the months that followed, NCMEC and the GBI received dozens of public tips from across the United States. Someone swore they saw a girl who looked like Ava at a Tennessee gas station. Another reported a young woman with similar features at a Florida church. A third described a homeless teen in Alabama whose appearance closely matched the progressed photo. Yet every local follow-up ended in deadlock. The person cited was either someone else of similar age and general appearance, a fully identified individual, or in the case of homeless persons, their biological markers did not match Ava's profile. New tips continued to be logged, but none produced a concrete investigative link. In parallel, NCMEC recommended updating Ava's official description to reflect her presumed current age and possible changes if she had survived prolonged captivity. Hair might be longer or cut short, her face thinner, body weight significantly fluctuated, and she might bear minor scars or marks from limited living conditions. This expanded description was added to federal systems to improve differentiation from other young adult women. The suspect description was also refined based on 1990s behavioral analysis. A high probability the perpetrator had experience evading community oversight, knew local terrain well, could move a victim across areas without drawing attention, and used an older vehicle as the primary means of removal from the scene. Though these were indirect analytical conclusions, they were added to the file to broaden the pool of potential suspect profile. Nevertheless, updated descriptions, age-progressed images, and wider dissemination did not change the core reality. No new physical evidence linked Ava to any location after. No clear fingerprints beyond the contaminated sample that had loosely matched Hale. No new witnesses with solid descriptions. No vehicle ever traced that matched the original white van. Every public tip ended in no match, meaning the age-progressed images served only to keep attention alive, not to generate real leads. Ultimately, despite full updates in the federal system and NCMEC's ongoing monitoring of new tips, the case status remained unchanged. Insufficient data, no investigative direction, and no connection between old evidence and any current information. Ava Wilson's file thus stayed on the cold case list with no genuine signs of progress. Even after every available support tool of the era had been deployed, years of no movement had pushed Ava's case into near silence, until an entirely unrelated incident in Columbia, South Carolina, unexpectedly produced a breakthrough no one saw coming. While processing the scene of a home invasion that escalated to violent assault, local officers recovered an unidentified DNA sample from items the perpetrator had touched. Under the new nationwide protocol, the sample was uploaded to CODIS for comparison against the national database. When results came back, lab technicians were startled to receive a significant hit with an old profile stored since the early 90s. That old DNA traced back through its archive code was the biological trace recovered from Ava Wilson's backpack zipper pull, a sample once deemed too contaminated due to improper 1990 collection methods, but retained in passive storage under cold case evidence retention policy. The CODIS match was not random. The genetic markers were strong enough to link the two cases, despite a 21-year gap. Detailed analysis of the fresh Columbia sample quickly identified the person who left it, Edward Hale. Cross-checking Hale's record exposed all the earlier mistakes that had kept him from being a priority suspect: misentered ID codes, incomplete alibi checks, and scattered witness description. The CODIS hit became the first scientifically robust evidence, strong enough to place Hale back at the center. When the GBI received the federal lab notification, the cold case unit immediately activated the Ava Wilson file for re-evaluation. Investigator Sarah Langford, who had reviewed Ava's file in 1995, was brought back, along with two newer GBI investigators, to form the initial analysis team. The first step was re-examining all old data to confirm the zipper DNA was deposited during Ava's abduction. Analysis showed Hale's DNA could not have appeared through later environmental contamination because the sample had been resealed in cold case storage since the mid-1990s, and untouched for over a decade. This ruled out coincidental contamination. Once the DNA evidence was deemed strong enough to reopen the investigation, the GBI officially reactivated Ava Wilson's case. Specialized units were assigned. One traced Hale's residential movements since 1990. Another re-examined every report mentioning a white van in the area. A third cross-referenced Hale's behavior during periods Ava was presumed held. To scale up, the GBI requested federal coordination and received assistance from the FBI, U.S. Marshals Service, and an interagency task force was formed with clear lanes: perpetrator behavior, possible interstate movement, suspected holding locations, and any irregular financial or residential activity by Hale over 2 decades. The investigative effort focused on filling the 1990-2011 void, the period Ava had completely vanished from public record. Though victim status remained unknown, confirming Hale via DNA marked the first time in 21 years the case had courtroom-viable forensic evidence. It was also the first time investigators had a clear intersection between 1990 physical evidence and a specific individual. For a cold case that had languished in silence so long, the CODIS match was the clearest signal yet that Ava Wilson's disappearance was no longer consigned to the gray zone of stalled files, but had entered an entirely new phase of investigation. The 2011 DNA confirmation that Hale left trace evidence on Ava's property immediately placed him at the center of the case, forcing the interagency task force to scrutinize his entire residential and travel history from the late 1980s to the present. Administrative records revealed Hale moved frequently, mostly short-term stays or low-cost rentals, motels in Evans, a month-to-month cabin on the edge of Sumter National Forest, multiple temporary addresses in North Georgia, and scattered locations around Columbia. When his residency timeline was overlaid with utility records, financial transactions, and seasonal work receipts, two critical overlaps emerged. Hale lived in Evans at the exact time Ava vanished in 1919, and he relocated to the Sumter National Forest border area shortly afterward. These moves suspiciously aligned with the presumed captivity phases inferred from evidence and behavioral profiling. The task force expanded scrutiny to every property Hale had owned or rented over 2 decades, including storage units, old garages, an abandoned trailer on the outskirts of Athens, and especially a detached backyard structure at a rental house in Columbia, the same property where Hale's DNA was recovered in the 20s. Each site was checked against lease documents, inventory lists, repair receipts, and statements from landlords, neighbors, or anyone who had contact with Hale. Many locations had been derelict long enough for natural traces to degrade, but some interior surfaces remained largely undisturbed. While searching the old Athens trailer Hale once occupied, investigators found no direct sign of Ava, but on an interior wall panel, 3 faint scratched letters, AWA, caught their attention. At first glance, the mark could have been random, but when forensic technicians compared the stroke characteristic to Ava's known school handwriting samples, The similarity in the shape of the letter A made the carving potential evident. The task force added the scratching to supplemental evidence, because both the trailer's location and Hale's residency period in Athens matched the theorized victim transport timeline. Though it could not yet be concluded when or by whom the letters were made, the mark was sufficient to reinforce that Hale had direct contact with the victim during the relevant period and was not merely linked by old trace evidence. During the broader investigation, the detached Columbia structure, where Hale's DNA surfaced in 2011, became a focal point. The building was separate from the main house, windows boarded from the inside, and the landlord stated Hale rarely allowed anyone inside during his tenancy. When the task force searched it, they looked not only for evidence tied to the recent break-in, but also for signs of activity years earlier. The old wood surfaces still had original peeling paint, preserving faint scratches or impressions difficult to erase. They analyzed nail patterns, replaced wood sections, and structural anomalies to determine whether Hale had modified the space to isolate someone. Although no item directly confirmed Ava's presence, the unusual repairs inside the structure and Hale's residency timeline continued to align with the night. All findings were compiled into the task force report, formally designating Hale the primary suspect at the highest risk level, and identifying the Columbia outbuilding as a priority site for deeper investigation to clarify his role in Ava Wilson's prolonged disappearance. The detached building at the Columbia property became the primary red flag, forcing the task force to shift from background file collection to active field operations. The first step was deploying a covert surveillance team to maintain 24/7 eyes on Edward Hale and determine whether his current behavior matched the long-term victim control pattern. A small joint GBI-FBI unit was positioned at multiple points around the rented house, a fixed surveillance van more than 100 meters away, a close tail-foot team to track movement habits, and a technical team handling audio and thermal feeds from the outbuilding area. When surveillance began, Hale was living alone with no visible social activity, making his routine the sole focus. For nearly the first 2 weeks, the team logged Hale's daily movements. He left the house each morning at fairly consistent times, bought modest amounts of groceries a few miles away, occasionally stopped at a gas station or small repair shop, then returned home without prolonged contact with anyone. What stood out were certain days when he came back almost an hour earlier than usual, then never left again, did not turn on lights in the main house, and went straight to the outbuilding where daylight illumination was almost never seen. At night, surveillance documented a striking pattern. Hale left the main house multiple times, each time carrying a low-power flashlight, entered the outbuilding for 3 minutes, then returned, carefully locked up, and resumed silent activity inside the main house. The frequency increased noticeably on days he bought larger quantities of food or bottled water. These observations led the task force to seriously consider that Hale was hiding another person in the outbuilding, an hypothesis that aligned perfectly with the Ava investigation. To confirm, the technical team installed a long-lens remote camera aimed directly at the outbuilding door, capturing all entries and exits. Although direct audio inside was impossible without entry, the camera recorded Hale opening and closing the door at specific times, sometimes carrying bags of food or bottles of water. Even without seeing inside, the repetitive action strongly suggested regular control over a space he did not otherwise occupy. For more objective data, the task force deployed ultra-sensitive audio sensors at a safe distance from the outbuilding, capable of picking up low-frequency sound. Early recordings captured only Hale's footsteps and ambient noise, but by the third analysis cycle, the system detected a distinct secondary sequence, faint movements, breathing, or regular rustling that did not match Hale's gait or timing. Crucially, these sounds appeared only when Hale was not inside the outbuilding, making a second-person origin far more credible. In addition to audio, the technical team used thermal imaging to analyze heat signatures from inside the structure. Every night, the outbuilding showed a steady heat source at the center, impossible if the space contained only objects or equipment. The moderate, non-fluctuating temperature, independent of Hale's movements, further supported the presence of a minimally mobile person confined in a small area. Multi-day comparisons showed the heat signature remained after Hale left, and only dropped slightly when he delivered food or water, consistent with long-term hidden captivity. Based on the combined audio-thermal dataset, the task force began calculating the probability that Ava was still alive. An internal meeting among GBI FBI and Marshal Service personnel compiled every piece of evidence. DNA linking Hale, residence history matching Ava's suspected route, the AWA marking in Athens, and now clear signs of a captive in the Columbia outbuilding. Behavioral experts on long-term abductions evaluated Hale's pattern and concluded it fit the profile of an offender who maintains a victim in total isolation with regular supply cycles, minimal external sound light exposure, and a tiny space for psychological control. The task force raised its internal alert level, determining the likelihood Ava was alive was high enough to justify continued intense surveillance. Additional personnel were added, rotating 24/7 coverage of Hale, while audio-thermal monitoring ran non-stop to gather passive evidence without alerting him. All data pointed to the same conclusion. Someone other than Hale was present in the Columbia outbuilding, and the strong probability was that it was the victim missing for nearly. The surveillance data was now strong enough to prove a person was being held captive in the outbuilding, leaving the task force no room for further delay. The next step was drafting an emergency federal search warrant application. Reports detailing the DNA match, Hale's residence history, audio-thermal signatures, and control behavior over the outbuilding were compiled into a comprehensive presentation that emphasized the victim was in prolonged captivity and could be in immediate danger if Hale detected surveillance. A federal judge approved and signed the warrant the same day, also authorizing tactical force in case Hale was armed or barricaded. With the warrant in hand, SWAT and a joint GBI-FBI tactical team immediately planned the raid. A short briefing assigned roles. The primary entry team would hit the outbuilding. A second team would seal the main house to prevent escape. Technical operators stood ready to breach reinforced locks. Surveillance showed Hale typically woke late, so dawn was chosen to minimize resistance and maximize victim safety. While Columbia was still shrouded in morning fog, numerous unmarked vehicles moved in using dispersed formation to avoid noise. SWAT teams approached from 3 directions and established a full perimeter in under 15 seconds. 2 breachers placed charges on the outbuilding doorframe, while the stack prepared weapons. On the go signal, a sharp, clean breach exploded the lock, and the heavy steel door flew open in seconds. A wave of damp, moldy air rushed out, followed by pitch blackness. The entry team flooded in with tactical lights sweeping the space, but what they saw was an empty room. No person, no bed, no signs of life. Only after a second sweep did an officer notice hairline seams running along the back wall, marks of a false panel. Technical operators were called in immediately. Within seconds they confirmed a deliberately concealed chamber behind reinforced plywood. A section of wall was removed with tools, revealing a small metal door with no handle. When it was forced open, tactical lights poured into the hidden room, and there they found a thin woman with long matted hair, wearing a faded old shirt, curled in the corner. She turned toward the light, instinctively shielding her eyes, then shrank back as if she had not seen another human in years. When an officer called Ava, she did not react at first, but on the second call a trembling, raspy sound escaped her parched throat, a mix of exhaustion and terror. The woman was Ava Wilson, now 35 years old, alive after more than 2 decades of total isolation. The newly discovered cell was barely larger than a storage closet. No windows, only a thin mattress on the floor, an old blanket, a water basin and a few basic items were all that had sustained her at minimum survival level for years. Medics were rushed in and carried Ava out of the space that had stolen more than half her life. Simultaneously, the main house containment team took Edward Hale into custody on the back porch steps. He had no time to react, flee or destroy evidence. As he was cuffed and led away, Hale remained completely silent. Exactly the control pattern he had enforced on his victim for decades. With Ava found alive and Hale detained on site, the task force finally closed the most dangerous phase of the investigation, marking a historic turning point in Rescuing Ava in a state of extreme exhaustion and long-term isolation required the task force to conduct formal identification immediately. Despite near-perfect circumstantial alignment, federal law demands scientific proof for every cold case victim. Once Ava was transported to a secure GBI medical facility in Columbia, the forensic team began comparison with 1990 dental records retained by Lakeside Middle School. X-rays of 14-year-old Ava's teeth were pulled and matched against new images taken post-rescue. Although decades of captivity had caused significant dental wear, enamel degradation and minor misalignment, core features, arch shape, incisor angle, and 2 old fillings in the lower jaw matched perfectly, yielding a very high preliminary dental confirmation. In parallel, GBI performed DNA testing for absolute verification. Blood and buccal swabs were collected from Ava at the medical facility, while reference samples came from her mother Linda Wilson and preserved hair from the original case file. When entered into CODIS and run through kinship algorithms, results returned a 99.9999% match, legally confirming the rescued woman was Ava Wilson, missing since night. This was the final legal identification, allowing the task force to officially stamp her identity after more than 21 years. Meanwhile, the forensic team processed the hidden cell as a primary crime scene. Every surface, floorboard, wall crevice and object was scanned for fingerprints, DNA, fibers, hair, biological traces, or anything proving Ava's long presence. They recovered Hale's fingerprints on the metal door, water container, and wall surfaces, as well as Ava's DNA on the mattress, blanket and personal items left for years. A small tattered notebook with scribbled markings was found hidden in a floor crack. Though the content was unclear, the handwriting structure matched Ava's school records, indicating attempts to mark time or leave memory cues. Layered dust and wear patterns on the floor were analyzed to estimate victim movement phases. Stratified dust samples confirmed continuous occupancy over many years, aligning with Ava's captivity timeline. Additionally, forensic examiners studied the cell's construction. The false wall was determined to be Hale's own work, built with plywood, wooden framing and industrial adhesive to create a concealed chamber between the real wall and the camouflage panel. Saw marks, old nails and dried glue layers allowed a rough construction timeline. The secret room had existed for years and been reinforced in stages, supporting the theory that Hale moved Ava multiple times before settling on this final containment method in Colombia. Concurrently, investigators conducted cautious, limited interviews with Ava to complete identification and build the captivity timeline, spacing questions into short sessions due to her severe psychological state. From what Ava could recall, combined with forensic findings, the task force reconstructed the captivity phases: the Evans house as the starting point, then a cabin on the edge of Sumter National Forest, a trailer near Athens, and finally the long-term hidden cell in Colombia. Environmental analysis, soil traces on old blankets, wood rot levels, and remaining items corroborated each location Ava described. Numerous details she provided matched physical evidence with astonishing accuracy, distant car sounds in the final phase matching the outbuilding's distance from the road, damp wood smells from the forest phase matching residual Sumter soil on old items, and her description of faint light through board cracks, matching the completely sealed final cell. When all forensic data, dental records, DNA, physical evidence and environmental markers were combined, Ava's identification file reached absolute certainty. GBI affixed legal verification that the survivor found in Colombia was indeed Ava Wilson, missing for over 21 years. Clearing the way for the next phase of investigation and legal proceedings against Edward Hale. The completion of dental and DNA identification cleared the way for the next step, officially informing the Wilson family that Ava had been found alive. When the news reached Richmond County, Linda and Michael immediately set out for Lexington Hospital, where Ava was being cared for in a special GBI security ward. The drive to the hospital took place in a state that was almost indescribable. 21 years of hope, despair, waiting, and pain compressed into the moment they would finally see Ava in the flesh. Upon arrival, they were taken to a monitored waiting room and went through the mandatory legal next-of-kin verification process. Investigators presented personal details only the family could know: a small scar on Ava's hand from a bicycle fall at age 8, a mole in the hollow of her left shoulder, the habit of writing the letter A with a slight rightward slant. Linda recognized everything, but the moment that truly made her break down was seeing the medical file, which clearly listed general health conditions and confirmed the identity matched the Ava. Once the formalities were complete, medical staff escorted Linda and Michael into the recovery room where Ava lay. The space was quiet, softly lit, and filled with the gentle beeping of monitors, creating an atmosphere that felt both fragile and sacred. Ava was propped against pillows, thin but with eyes that brightened faintly when she saw them enter. Linda froze for only a few seconds before rushing forward and wrapping her daughter in trembling arms. Michael stood beside them, placing a hand on his sister's shoulder, a gesture he had done countless times before the tragedy. Ava couldn't speak much, but her shaky breathing, wet eyes, and the tightening return embrace, little by little, were enough to confirm that the family had recovered the piece missing for more than 2 decades. After the reunion moment, the medical and psychological team began an emergency support program for Ava. They explained her physical condition to the family: weight loss, vitamin deficiencies, muscle tension from confined space, and signs of prolonged stress. However, the primary concern was Ava's psychological state, the result of years completely cut off from the outside world. Psychologists spent time assessing her reactions to basic stimuli and instructed the family to maintain a stable environment, avoiding pressure or demands to recall events too soon. Meanwhile, the GBI finalized handover procedures, determining Ava was no longer in immediate danger and could recover in a safe space. A long-term care plan was established, including continuous medical monitoring, intensive psychotherapy, and social reintegration support. In the early recovery stage, Ava spoke only briefly, answering in single words or nods, but the constant gentle presence of her family created a safe zone she had not had for many years. Every step forward began with the smallest things: eating more fully, sleeping in a room with natural light, hearing loved ones' voices, and feeling freedom again without being locked behind false walls. This was the beginning of a long process to help Ava reclaim herself after 21 years stolen from a normal life. The initial phase after reunion showed Ava responding relatively well to the new safe environment, but in-depth evaluations by the medical and psychological teams at Lexington Hospital revealed that her recovery journey would span many years. Detailed medical reports documented severe effects from long-term captivity, chronic malnutrition, low muscle density, delayed reflexes, and numerous sleep issues due to a disrupted circadian rhythm. At the same time, the psychology team identified classic PTSD symptoms: hypervigilance, stress reactions to unfamiliar sounds, difficulty accepting open spaces, and occasional freezing when exposed to information that triggered memories of isolation. To help, the hospital implemented a PTSD treatment protocol, combining talk therapy, gentle exposure therapy, and cognitive restructuring exercises to help Ava regain a sense of control. During this period, Ava typically communicated in short sentences, sometimes only gestures or eye contact, but the steady presence of Linda and Michael created a vital safe zone that anchored her to reality. The hardest transition for Ava was not just physical recovery, but learning to exist in a world completely changed since everything: cell phones, the internet, communication methods, the noise of modern society, was alien to her. Therapists designed a step-by-step social adaptation program, gradually increasing outdoor light exposure, familiarizing her with traffic sounds, small group therapy sessions, simulating real-life situations, and relearning basic daily skills most people take for granted. Ava had to learn how to choose food, use personal items, regulate eating and sleeping rhythms, and process stimuli she had been completely deprived of before. The Wilson family also had to go through the process of rebuilding relationships after a 21-year gap. Linda wanted both to protect her daughter and to avoid making Ava feel controlled. Michael grappled with lingering guilt for not keeping Ava safe that afternoon, and family counselors helped them reconstruct healthy communication patterns, avoid unrealistic expectations, and focus on small positive changes. Patience became the key factor, because Ava needed time to understand that family was no longer just a memory, but now a real source of support. While recovery continued, the family received regular updates on the legal proceedings against Edward Hale. After his arrest at the scene, Hale was transferred to GBI custody and then to federal court for charges related to kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and serious endangerment of a victim. The task force continued supplying evidence collected from the captivity room, forensic analyses, and the captivity timeline to support prosecution. Every detail from DNA on the backpack zipper to the false wall structure of the outbuilding was compiled into a prosecution file of immense legal weight. Although Ava was not yet able to give full testimony, her initial statements combined with physical evidence formed a critical foundation confirming Hale's direct role in the prolonged captivity. The post-reunion phase thus became 2 parallel journeys: Ava slowly emerging from 2 decades of deprivation, and the justice system tightening the circle around the man responsible for the entire tragedy. In both journeys, the family remained the most important connection, where Ava relearned safety, and justice began to take shape after more than 21 years of waiting. While Ava's recovery and legal proceedings against Hale continued, the task force faced questions that would never be fully answered, starting with the biggest gap in the entire file: the exact location where Ava was held between 1995 and 19. Although forensics matched some dust, rotted wood and environmental traces, none of Hale's known residences perfectly corresponded to Ava's descriptions of space, sounds or light during that period. Abandoned cabins around Sumter National Forest had been demolished. Many old wooden structures no longer existed, and witnesses living nearby did not recall ever seeing Hale or anything suspicious. This turned the 3-year period between captivity sites into an untraceable shadow, forcing the file to record it as an irrecoverable blind spot. Similarly, Hale's full motive, why he chose Ava, why he maintained captivity for over 2 decades, and why he moved her multiple times, was never established. Psychological profiles showed tendencies toward control and isolation of others, but there was no clear medical record or prior violent history sufficient to explain the shift to prolonged kidnapping. He never answered any questions about his actions or motives, and remained almost completely silent during interrogation, replicating the very control that had terrorized Ava. The question of whether Hale had other victims also went unanswered. The task force reviewed dozens of missing person cases in the Georgia-South Carolina area, from the late 1980s to the early 2000s, but none yielded physical evidence or DNA linking to Hale. Nevertheless, his constant movement, isolated lifestyle, and short-term residences meant investigators could not rule out additional victims who left no trace. The official conclusion had to state, "No evidence confirming additional victims, but the possibility cannot be entirely excluded." During analysis of the captivity room and older sites, some markings Ava left, symbols, tally marks, time tracking patterns, still could not be fully deciphered. Some appeared to be day counts, tracking rare light cycles or mental symbols to preserve her sense of self during years of isolation. But several markings did not match any pattern Ava remembered after rescue. They may have been created during extreme stress states she no longer recalled clearly. Psychologists confirmed this is common among long-term captivity victims, so they became incomplete pieces in the overall case picture. All hope of illuminating the darkest parts of Hale's file ended permanently when he died in 2013 of heart failure, while in pretrial detention. Hale's death cut off forever any possibility of questioning motive, locations or confirming other victims. His legal file was closed per regulation, with only the portion related to Ava retained as historical evidence of the 20. The remaining mysteries, motive, lost captivity locations and irreconstructible time periods, became permanently unfinished parts of the case, leaving an echo no file could ever fully explain. Hale's death closed the final door to answers for the case's lingering mysteries, and as the investigative team completed the last sections of the file, they had to confront the chain of errors that allowed Ava's recovery to take more than 2 decades. The GBI's final summary highlighted that the most mistakes occurred in 1990. The runaway theory was accepted too quickly. The school gate scene was not secured. Items like the backpack zipper and books were not collected or sealed to forensic standards. Witness statements were recorded haphazardly, and data entry errors caused a key suspect to be removed from priority lists. These mistakes not only prolonged the investigation, but inadvertently allowed Hale to keep Ava hidden for years undetected. From the case, GBI drew critical forensic lessons. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, can become crucial if properly preserved. The fact that the fingerprint on the zipper was only discovered thanks to 2011 technology underscored the value of long-term evidence retention and the need for quality control tracking in cold case storage. GBI also overhauled data entry procedures to prevent identifier code errors like the one with Hale, a tiny mistake with massive consequences. Beyond forensics, the Ava case drove sweeping changes in how missing minor reports are handled in Georgia. After reviewing the entire investigation, GBI issued new guidelines requiring every missing child under 16 to be classified high priority within the first hours, regardless of runaway assumptions. Scenes must be strictly preserved, and all descriptions of vehicles, strangers, dropped items, or environmental changes must be documented to a clear timeline standard. These rules became mandatory training for local police departments to prevent repetition of the mistakes that caused Ava's case to be missed during the critical early window. The Ava Wilson case also became an official case study at the GBI Training Academy. Every year, new classes analyze the file from multiple angles: offender behavior, 1990s forensic limitations, long-term captivity victim psychology, and especially the role of modern DNA technology in breaking seemingly insurmountable dead ends. Beyond operational lessons, the case is used to emphasize the importance of persistence in cold cases, that a file, no matter how faded, can come back to life if evidence is preserved and data kept current. After more than 21 years, the final status line was entered into the system: case status closed, victim recovered. The case closed, not with complete answers to every mystery, but with Ava Wilson's extraordinary survival, profound improvements to Georgia's investigative system, and a commitment that the mistakes once made would never be repeated in any future missing child case. The Ava Wilson story is not just a gripping case, it shines a clear light on what Americans today still face: complacency with missing minors, systemic gaps, and the power of persistence. In 1990 at Lakeside Middle School, police hastily labeling Ava a runaway, failing to secure the scene, overlooking the strange white van, and carelessly collecting and storing evidence like the backpack zipper, were errors that kept a little girl imprisoned for. In today's United States, parents and communities cannot rely solely on the system. We must learn to ask questions and protect our children as fiercely as Linda did, challenging the runaway label, keeping posters up, calling the press, refusing to let the case fade. The fact that GBI rediscovered the fingerprint on the zipper and got a 2011 CODIS hit to Edward Hale's DNA reminds us that science can only help when initial data is carefully collected and preserved, from school cameras and teacher reports to community members promptly reporting suspicious vans near campus. The image of 35-year-old Ava rescued from a hidden room behind a false wall in Columbia, after surveillance noticed signs of a second person in the outbuilding, is a powerful reminder about surviving victims. They need time, PTSD therapy, and a family that listens without forcing them to relive everything. Applied to life today, the lesson is not just don't talk to strangers, but teach kids to recognize unusual situations, like a strange man with an unfamiliar van. Encourage them to tell adults, demand clear missing person protocols from schools and local police, support organizations like NCMEC, and age progression for cold cases. And above all, remember that behind every missing photo is someone's Ava, who might still be alive, waiting for adults who never give up. Thank you for following the journey to find Ava Wilson, a reminder that no missing person case deserves to be forgotten. Please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us for reopened cold cases and truths finally brought to light.